September 1945, Tokyo. The war was over, but the air still carried the scent of smoke and surrender. Inside a half-damaged school building, a row of Japanese women stood silently, former officers of the Women's Volunteer Corps. Their khaki uniforms, once symbols of pride, were now torn and threadbare. The room was cold, the floor scattered with paper tags from confiscated belongings. Across from them, American women, Red Cross nurses and relief volunteers, unpacked crates stamped U.S. Army supplies. One by one, they handed out folded dresses, soft fabric, shoes. For a moment, no one spoke. When a Japanese officer lifted a cotton blouse to her face and began to weep, the silence deepened. Defeat had a scent, and kindness had found its way through it. By August 1945, Japan was a nation on the brink of collapse. Cities lay in ruins, food was scarce, factories were silent, and the emperor's voice, broadcast to the people for the first time on August 15th, announced an unthinkable word: surrender. The war that had once stretched proudly across Asia and the Pacific now ended in ashes. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shattered more than cities. They shattered belief. For millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians, everything drilled into them for years, honor, obedience, sacrifice, crumbled in an instant. As American forces prepared to occupy Japan, they faced a nation starving, broken, and filled with uncertainty. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, led by General Douglas MacArthur, was tasked with not just disarming a former enemy, but rebuilding an entire society. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan signed the formal instrument of surrender. Less than a week later, Allied troops began landing in the home islands. In Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, and dozens of smaller towns, the occupation began. An extraordinary moment when conquerors stepped into the homes of the conquered, not as destroyers, but as administrators and, at times, reluctant caretakers. Among those who awaited them were thousands of women who had served the Japanese Empire, in factories, in hospitals, in communication units, and in the Joshi Teishintai, the Women's Volunteer Corps. Some had trained with rifles, others had worked in logistics, code-breaking, or nursing under military command. By September, most had been ordered to disband. When the new occupiers arrived, the former officers and auxiliaries faced an identity stripped bare. Their uniforms, once symbols of patriotism, became badges of guilt. They were no longer protectors of the nation, but reminders of a lost cause. And yet, amid that humiliation, a different kind of confrontation began. One not fought with weapons or ideology, but with gestures of mercy. It started quietly, with boxes of supplies, relief trucks, and a few dozen American women stepping into the ruins. Before the war's end, the Japanese state had drawn women into the machinery of total conflict. By 1944, shortages of labor and manpower led to the creation of the Women's Volunteer Corps, Joshi Teishintai, Studentihus where hundreds of thousands of young women were mobilized to work in military factories, communications offices, and defense networks. Some received ranks, uniforms, and military-style training. A few, especially in administrative or nursing units, were officially recognized as officers within the imperial structure. In propaganda, they were called the Mothers of Victory, the silent backbone of the empire. But behind the patriotic posters and speeches lay exhaustion and fear. As bombings intensified, many female workers and officers faced starvation, overwork, and the constant shadow of death. By mid-1945, ration cards meant little. Cities like Tokyo and Yokohama were fields of ash. When Japan surrendered, these women were left in an impossible position. The state that had glorified them vanished overnight. Their ranks, titles, and symbols of authority were stripped away. Uniforms, once worn with pride, now invited suspicion or contempt. The Japanese Home Ministry ordered the demobilization of all women's auxiliary units, While the Allied occupation forces required all former military personnel, male or female, to register and surrender any government-issued clothing or insignia. Many female officers hid their uniforms or burned them. Others clung to them, not out of defiance, but because they had nothing else to wear. Civilian clothing was scarce. Factories that once produced garments had been destroyed. Winter was approaching, and the black market cost of a single coat could exceed a month's salary. Into this landscape of ruin came American women, members of relief organizations such as the American Red Cross, the YWCA, and the Women's Army Corps, WAC. Unlike combat troops, their mission was humanitarian, to assist with hospitals, food distribution, and civilian welfare under SCAP oversight. Many of these volunteers were young, some barely in their 20s. They had seen the Pacific War's horrors from the other side. Letters from brothers or fiancés who never came home and now found themselves face to face with the people once labeled as the enemy. Reports from the occupation archives describe these first meetings as quiet, restrained, yet deeply human. In makeshift clinics, schools, and relief centers, Japanese women, once officers, now refugees in their own homeland, met their counterparts from across the ocean. The encounters would begin awkwardly, but end in a way no one had expected. Because what began as aid soon became something more profound, a moment of shared humanity. When the occupation began, the faces of Japan's defeat were not only soldiers returning from battlefields, but also the women who had worn the emperor's insignia. Many of these women were barely in their 20s, clerks, nurses, instructors, and administrative officers of the Women's Volunteer Corps. They had been trained to serve the empire with quiet precision. Now, stripped of their rank and identity, they wandered the ruins of Tokyo in threadbare uniforms that marked them as relics of a fallen cause. In Japanese culture, clothing was not simply fabric. It carried status, discipline, and respectability. To lose it was to lose the self. So when American relief workers offered them civilian dresses, blouses, and coats, it was more than an exchange of garments. It was the painful act of shedding a national identity and accepting mercy from the very people once seen as the enemy. Witness accounts describe tears not of gratitude alone, but of humiliation, relief, and disbelief, emotions that decades of militarism had buried beneath discipline. The gesture was small, but it cracked open years of silence. Under General MacArthur's command, the Allied occupation pursued two simultaneous goals: demilitarization and democratization. Every institution linked to Japan's war machine, including women's auxiliary units, was to be dissolved. The goal was not only to disarm, but to reshape society's foundations. The American administration issued directives that forbade the display of military insignia or rank. Civilian clothing became a symbol of compliance with the new order. Relief efforts, often led by female American staff, were used not merely to provide material aid, but to encourage the transition from a militarized identity to a peaceful civilian one. Through the distribution of food, medicine, and clothing, the occupation forces hoped to replace the spirit of the imperial cult with a sense of individual dignity. It was a subtle but deliberate psychological operation. Mercy as a form of re-education. When Japanese women accepted garments from their former enemies, they also accepted a future detached from the emperor's command. That exchange, quiet and humane, became an unspoken part of Japan's reconstruction policy. The end of the war forced both sides to confront moral gray zones. Many of the Japanese women receiving aid had indirectly supported a system that waged brutal campaigns across Asia. Yet the American women who handed them clothes had not come as judges. They came as witnesses to human ruin. To those who had served the empire, the encounter felt like a reckoning, not through tribunals or punishment, but through compassion. Accepting kindness was harder than enduring defeat, because it demanded the acknowledgement of shared humanity. For the Americans, too, there was an emotional weight. Some volunteers later wrote that seeing Japanese women cry made the war feel finished. They realized that victory meant more than conquest. It meant restoring what had been stripped away from both sides, empathy. And in that fragile moment of exchange, guilt and forgiveness briefly occupied the same room. In pre-war Japan, clothing carried deep cultural symbolism. The uniform was not only attire, it was a visible extension of duty, hierarchy, and moral worth. To wear the khaki of the Women's Volunteer Corps was to belong to the nation's disciplined body. Even in defeat, many women continued to wear their faded uniforms because they had nothing else, but also because they could not imagine themselves outside that identity. Traditional kimono culture had long emphasized modesty, grace, and decorum. Western-style garments, by contrast, had been associated with modernity and, during the war, with militarization. Now, in 1945, a strange reversal occurred. The same Western garment, brought by American women, symbolized rebirth. When a Japanese officer slipped into a donated dress or coat, the act carried both loss and renewal. It was the shedding of imperial identity and the reluctant step into a new, uncertain world shaped by the victor's values. For many, it was also the first tactile experience of softness after years of scarcity. Cotton that wasn't rationed, buttons that weren't improvised, shoes that actually fit. In occupation reports, several American volunteers noted the same thing. They touched the fabric as if it were something sacred. It wasn't just comfort they felt, it was transformation. Among the first to arrive in post-surrender Japan were American women of the Red Cross, Army Nurse Corps, and civilian relief divisions. They were professionals, yet their mission carried emotional complexity. Many had lost brothers or fiancés in the Pacific War. Some had treated wounded American soldiers who spoke bitterly of Japan. And yet, here they were, distributing food, bandages, and clothing to those once called the enemy. They entered burned-out hospitals, makeshift shelters, and camps where disease spread faster than hope. Many Japanese civilians were skeletal from malnutrition. Tuberculosis and typhus haunted every corner. These American women documented the scenes in their field notes. Careful, clinical, but beneath the lines, compassion bled through. When they met female Japanese officers, the air would stiffen. Both sides would bow awkwardly, each unsure how to act. Then, inevitably, the tension would soften. A nurse would gesture with a smile, hold out a parcel, and the officer, often trembling, would accept. Relief work was supposed to be about logistics, but it became something deeper. Those moments of exchange weren't scripted by any occupation policy. They were, in their quietness, acts of shared mourning, one side for its dead, the other for its nation. Defeat didn't end war in the minds of those who lived it. For Japanese women who had worn the uniform, shame became a silent inheritance. Many avoided eye contact with the Americans. Others felt anger at their own tears. For the American relief workers, victory was equally complex. They had been trained to view Japan as ruthless and inhuman. Yet now they saw hunger, grief, and frailty identical to their own. In their journals, words like strange pity, unbearable gentleness, and the first time I saw them as women, not enemies, appear again and again. These encounters revealed what the war had hidden, that beneath the uniforms, ideology, and propaganda, the human heart remained the same. And that realization, quiet, personal, and unspectacular, set the stage for a profound turning point. It happened in the closing weeks of 1945, as Tokyo's chill deepened and the ashes of war hardened into winter dust. The city had become a vast wound, half the homes gone, streets filled with scavengers, families burning scraps of wood for warmth. Amid that ruin stood a converted elementary school in Shinjuku, designated by SCAP as a women's relief station. Here, several dozen former Japanese female officers and nurses waited in silence. Their hair was cropped to regulation length, their uniforms faded and stiff from wear. Each carried a tag with a name and unit, relics of a hierarchy that no longer existed. The doors opened. A team of American women, mostly Red Cross workers, a few Army nurses, and civilian volunteers, entered carrying crates marked Relief Clothing, Pacific Command. They had been briefed that these women once served the Imperial Army. Some had overseen logistics, others tended to wounded soldiers in battlefront hospitals. Many had believed in Japan's victory until the very end. But now they stood trembling, eyes lowered, stripped of everything that once gave them purpose. A young American nurse, barely 23, began unpacking garments, plain dresses, coats, scarves, soft shoes. She smiled gently, uncertainly, and gestured for the first woman in line to step forward. The Japanese officer hesitated, clutching the frayed edge of her uniform. Then, slowly, she obeyed. The nurse held out a folded blue dress. The woman reached for it with both hands, the gesture of respect used for sacred objects. For a few seconds, she just stared. Then, without warning, tears streamed down her face. She pressed the fabric to her cheek and began to sob. Not loudly, but with a kind of broken restraint that filled the room more than any sound could. Others followed. Some turned away to hide their tears. A few knelt and wept openly. It wasn't only gratitude. It was release. Years of indoctrination, hunger, fear, and pride collapsing under the unbearable gentleness of mercy. The Americans froze, unsure how to react. One nurse later wrote, "They cried as if the war had just ended that morning." Another said, "I never saw soldiers cry like that." No translator could fully explain what was happening, but everyone understood. That day, the small classroom became more than a relief center. It became a quiet battlefield, where the war's emotional surrender finally took place. Not through orders or signatures, but through the simple weight of a folded dress. The Japanese women changed into their new clothes in silence. When they emerged, some smiled faintly for the first time. The blue, brown, and white fabrics contrasted starkly against the gray rubble outside, as if color itself had returned to a country long drained of it. But beyond that moment of fragile peace, deeper questions lingered. What would become of these women now? And could a gift of kindness truly wash away years of war and indoctrination? The answers began to unfold in the days that followed, in the quiet halls of the occupation offices, and in the hearts of those who witnessed the moment firsthand. The scene that began inside a small relief classroom did not stay confined to that room. Word of what happened, of Japanese women breaking down in tears as American nurses handed them new clothes, spread through the occupation networks within days. Reports reached the Public Health and Welfare Division of ESCAP, where officers documented the event as an example of successful morale restoration among former female personnel. Yet, to those who were there, it was not policy. It was humanity breaking through the armor of ideology. In the following weeks, similar moments unfolded across Japan. In Osaka, Nagoya, and Yokohama, local women's relief teams, often guided by American Red Cross supervisors, distributed donated garments to demobilized female auxiliaries, widows, and hospital staff. Every encounter followed the same pattern: stiffness, silence, then sudden emotion. The women wept not because of material comfort, but because the act itself dismantled the invisible walls the war had built between victor and vanquished, woman and woman. One American officer described it in his field journal. "We expected resentment, but we saw something else, shame melting into gratitude. The uniforms came off, and for the first time, they looked free." Freedom, however, was not simple. For many Japanese women, accepting clothing from Americans meant accepting defeat. It meant acknowledging the failure of everything they had been told was sacred: emperor, nation, duty. The tears, therefore, carried layers: grief, humiliation, and something dangerously close to relief. Meanwhile, the Americans were changing too. The young Red Cross nurse who had handed out that first blue dress later wrote to her family in California, "I thought we were rebuilding a country, but maybe we were rebuilding ourselves, learning that compassion isn't weakness." These encounters subtly rewired the psychology of the occupation. SCAP officials noticed that where American female relief workers operated, tensions lessened. Civilians approached checkpoints with less hostility. Small gestures, a bow, a shared smile, a word of thanks, began replacing the rigid silence that had defined surrender. The power of the gesture rippled further still. Japanese newspapers, now censored but cautiously re-emerging, began publishing human interest pieces about foreign women helping Japanese mothers and nurses. The imperial image of the enemy woman, once depicted as heartless and crude, began to dissolve. In turn, American reports began to depict the Japanese population not as a faceless foe, but as a people capable of suffering, remorse, and renewal. The psychological war, once fought through propaganda, found its truce in empathy. By early 1946, the first winter of the occupation, clothing drives expanded nationwide. Hundreds of thousands of garments, many donated by American civilians, flowed through Yokohama's port. Japanese women's associations joined in, organizing equitable distribution to war widows and displaced families. The exchange had come full circle, but for those who remembered that first day, when an officer cried into a folded dress, nothing would ever feel quite the same. The uniforms of empire were gone, but something deeper had been restored. The ability to feel without fear. That was the real surrender. Quiet, unrecorded, but unforgettable. And as Japan began to rise from its ruins, the consequences of that moment of shared humanity started to take shape. In the months that followed, the physical rebuilding of Japan began, but the emotional reconstruction was already underway. What had started as a single gesture in a relief classroom became a quiet symbol of the new Japan emerging under occupation. Across the archipelago, the Allied administration accelerated the demobilization of all female auxiliary and paramilitary groups. By early 1946, the Women's Volunteer Corps had ceased to exist in any organized form. Many of its members, once officers, clerks, or nurses in uniform, now worked in hospitals, schools, or municipal offices under the supervision of SCAP's Civil Affairs Divisions. Official reports described them as reintegrated civilians, but beneath that bureaucratic label were lives starting over from nothing. For those women, the garments they had received became more than material aid. They were tokens of survival, symbols of a life that might still be worth rebuilding. Some former officers carefully folded their old uniforms and placed them in storage, never to be worn again. Others, unable to bear the memory, burned them in quiet ceremonies. The transformation from militarized servant of the emperor to independent civilian was not instantaneous. It came through small, ordinary acts. Washing new clothes, mending torn fabric, stepping outside without fear. The American women, too, carried the memory of those encounters. Letters and field reports sent back to Washington spoke not of victory parades or surrender ceremonies, but of tears, hunger, and humanity rediscovered. A Red Cross coordinator in Tokyo wrote, "You can rebuild buildings, but not souls." Yet sometimes a coat or a dress can start that work. Meanwhile, SCAP's Public Information Division used these moments to shape public perception. Photographs of American nurses assisting Japanese women were published in U.S. magazines such as Life and Collier's, framed as proof that democracy and compassion were taking root even in the heart of the former enemy. For Japan's domestic press, now monitored and partially reformed, the same images signaled hope, the gentle face of an occupation that, for once, did not crush but uplifted. Yet behind the images, the emotional residue remained for both sides. Because kindness, in the aftermath of war, was never simple. It was the beginning of peace, but also the first reminder of everything that peace could not undo. By the spring of 1946, the emotional weight of Japan's surrender began to shift from despair to introspection. The occupation's social reforms, women's suffrage, education equality, labor rights, were reshaping the country at astonishing speed. And within that transformation, the memory of those quiet relief rooms lingered like a hidden foundation. Many of the former female officers who once wept over donated clothing became early participants in Japan's post-war women's movements. Some worked in welfare offices, Others became teachers or nurses in the new democratic institutions. For them, the humiliation of defeat had transformed into a cautious determination. Never again to serve blindly. Never again to lose their humanity to a cause. American relief workers returned home, often uncertain how to describe what they had witnessed. The war, they had been told, was righteous and clear-cut, had ended in gestures of vulnerability they could never forget. In reunion conferences years later, several recalled that single image: Japanese women crying over simple cotton dresses. It was, they said, the first time they understood the phrase "winning the peace." ESCAP archives record that by 1947, Japan's clothing crisis had eased as industry revived. But in interviews decades later, survivors of the Women's Volunteer Corps still remembered the feel of those first American garments, not for their comfort, but for what they represented, the moment they stopped being soldiers and became human again. In Japan's post-war literature and oral histories, that moment reappears as a symbol of moral awakening. Authors like Fumiko Enchi and Aya Koda later wrote of the second skin, a metaphor for the clothing that replaced the armor of obedience. It marked the beginning of a new Japan, fragile yet capable of compassion. For the Americans, those small acts of mercy became part of a larger legacy, proof that occupation could be guided not only by power, but by empathy. When the last Red Cross teams withdrew in 1952, their work left no monuments, only quiet memories scattered across two nations. And within those memories, the image endured, the conquered and the conqueror standing together in silence, the sound of tears mingling with the rustle of new clothes. It was not the end of the story, but the point where war finally released its grip on the human heart. History often remembers wars through battles, numbers, and treaties, the visible signatures of victory and defeat. But sometimes, the true ending of a war hides in the quietest of moments: a folded dress, a trembling hand, a tear that finally breaks through silence. When the American women handed new clothes to the Japanese officers, no one knew they were witnessing a turning point greater than policy or politics. In that single gesture, the hierarchy of conqueror and conquered dissolved. What remained was something far older and more human: the need for dignity. War had stripped these women of identity, reducing them to symbols of ideology. The gift of a garment restored what the battlefield had taken: the right to feel, to be seen, to exist without a flag stitched to one's sleeve. For the Americans, too, the encounter reshaped meaning. Compassion did not erase the horrors of the Pacific War, but it revealed the cost of hate. They learned that rebuilding was not about erasing the past. It was about allowing humanity to breathe again within its ruins. Decades later, historians would call it a minor episode in the vast machinery of occupation. Yet for those who lived it, that day in 1945 was the true peace treaty, one written not in ink, but in tears. Because when one woman reached out to help another, and when the other, once an enemy, began to cry, it marked the precise moment when the world turned away from war and toward the fragile, enduring work of being human.